Okay. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to everyone joining online. My name is Matthijs. This is the third webinar out of a series of 3 on sustainable organizations. Today we will be talking about making it happen. The first one we talked about our analysis of unsustainable organizations. Last week we talked, or 2 weeks ago actually, we talked about imagination as a key process towards imagining a more sustainable society and more sustainable organizations. And today we will be talking about how can we make it happen. So, my name is Matthijs. I'm a professor of responsible management. With me is Andy Brookes, senior lecturer at the Lincoln International Business School. We're both from the Lincoln International Business School. And today we will both be here and talking about sustainable organizations. So in order to get to an understanding of how can we actually contribute individually and collectively to more sustainable organizations, let's analyze first where we are and see how can we move from the situation where we are now towards a more sustainable workplace. And so our analysis can also start, perhaps should start today at the analysis of our contemporary workplace, of our contemporary society. And if we look around us, if we watch the news, if we read the newspapers, and if we do that and see what is happening over the last years and months as well, what we can see is that we are literally moving into a more and more absurd world and a more absurd workplace. So on the right you can see a picture of what has become more and more common knowledge nowadays, and that of course is about global inequalities, wealth inequalities. And NOVIB, as for those who have missed that news, NOVIB has calculated that at this time the 8 richest men on earth own as much as the poorest half of the world population. So whereas inequality, income and wealth inequalities was always something that was present, we see now the rise to something that can be described as absurd. So what we could see is the absurdity of 8 men who own as much as the poorest half of our population in the world. So this is no longer some kind of inequality that is problematic. No, we are faced with a situation where we can actually observe the absurdity of just 8 people owning so much and holding therefore the power and the resources that could actually be used for a lot of problems, solving problems in our world. And at the same time, on the left of the screen, we have a somewhat dramatic image, but of course we all know what we're talking about, and those are the dramatic impacts of climate change on our societies globally. And with climate change, we could observe more or less the same kind of situation. So climate change has been a problem for so many decades already, but now we have entered a situation where climate change is affecting people and the planet worldwide. And we are faced with this absurdity, this enormous absurdity of climate change, the destruction of our world. But at the same time, are we doing enough to combat climate change? Not really, and we all see that. But what is happening here? So if we start from the analysis of that the world and our societies have become absurd, we also see that at the same time we continue to live our life as normal. So we also witness a process of what has been called in the literature and by others as hypernormalization, so the normalization of absurdity. So on the one hand, we are faced with these enormous global challenges, problems, climate change, inequalities, which have become utterly absurd. But at the same time, we are constantly aware and we're constantly faced with this process of hypernormalization. So the idea that even though we are continuously confronted at the daily level with all of the absurdities in our societies, we also continue to live our lives in pretending that everything is normal. In the first webinar, we also talked about business as usual and the need to stop this idea of pretending that we can just continue in organizations, in the workplace, in our economies, with the idea of business as usual. So in the workplace, we can actually observe a very similar kind of trend. So the hypernormalization of absurdity in our economies and in our workplaces. So at the same time that we are confronted with the destructive effects of climate change, the destructive effects of ever rising inequalities, and thus the growth of poverty and our inability to address these challenges, we also see that in organizations, in our economy, we just continue with our idea of business as usual. So hypernormalization in workplaces. So instead of globally raising the issue and really working towards addressing and solving the issues such as climate change and inequality and racism and so on and so on, the stock market is just going on. And on the right, you can see the stocks of Shell, one of the biggest oil producers in the world. And we see that since the COVID pandemic last year now, that the stock has only been rising. So instead of trying to really solve climate change and climate issues, we at the same time, we see that the industries who are largely responsible for these kind of climate change are making higher profits than ever. So over the last 2 webinars, we have talked in depth about these problems, and in the face of absurdity and hypernormalization, the basic question that, of course, is raised now, that we have to raise, is, okay, what can we do? What is to be done in order for us to individually, both and collectively, can deal with these changes? So the most important starting point for individuals, for organizations, for groups of individuals within organization is, of course, the idea of collective action. And this has been, of course, discussed widely over the last years, but at the same time, we are also seeing this hypernormalization of individualism, so that we are always expected to individually solve the greatest problems in our society. So when it comes to climate change, we need to individually insulate our houses, we have to recycle our waste, and so on and so on. So the solutions to the world's biggest problems are often still perceived to be things that we can solve individually. And we do not yet have a clear understanding of how we can actually collectively start to solve these problems. Now, as you can see, first of all, of course, our plea and our idea is that we need to collectively organize. So this is the first step towards change, to start collectively organizing. But then the question is, how can we do this? Now, as a first idea, and this is my last contribution in terms of the the first half of the session, and then Andy will take over. So first, what we can do collectively. One idea is that, for instance, that we should not just have unions, collective organizing to negotiate for working conditions. So what we have seen and what we know within organizations, within the economy, is the strength of collective organizing through trade unions and labor unions in order to negotiate working conditions for workers. But at the same time, one idea is now that we also extend such trade unions, such collective organizing towards sustainability. So what we in effect need to be doing is start to collectively organize in order to create truly sustainable organizations. And the final point that can be made here, perhaps, and an important point, is that, of course, with sustainability, we do not merely mean environmental sustainability in the sense of addressing the effects of climate change and the role of organizations the role of organizations in this process, but also we think of sustainability in a very broad notion. So it is also about the financial sustainability of our system, of our economy, and also the social sustainability. So the protection of the well-being and the health of people in and beyond organizations. So organizations can only be sustainable if they also treat their employees in the right way. So there we can also find the links with the existing trade unions. So now I will hand over to Andy, who will take it from here.
Thank you, Matthijs. I'm going to pick up on a couple of the things that ideas that Matthijs has already raised so far, and develop a few of those ideas. I'll do that for about another 15 minutes, and then we'll hopefully pick up some questions and have a discussion about some of the ideas that we've presented. Three things I really wanted to pick up on are ideas that Matthijs has introduced about the political nature of the challenges that we face. There's been lots of focus on technological and innovations to solve our sustainability problems, but much of it, we argue, is about a different way of organising, and that's political. It's about taking political action and dealing with the politics. Part of that is generally about the structures that exist that lead to unsustainability, but also it's about our contemporary politics, the nature of politics at the moment. And the other part then is linking finally back to this making it happen. What does that mean? What sort of language, what sort of conceptual thinking do we need to be able to make these transitions in a genuine way? Now, it isn't as if there hasn't been any political activity. There's been plenty of political activity at a global level and a national level. The problem is that's largely been ineffective. Lots of grand claims, lots of goal setting, lots of celebration after the Paris Climate Agreement, but in effect, the progress, we've carried on putting more emissions into the environment since Paris. We haven't reversed that trend. So there's some limitations, although there's political activity, political will, it's still ineffective and there's a degree of failure there. And there's a couple of reasons I would argue for that. One is that much of this political activity occurs within the current business as usual. So even though much activity, say at the COP meeting at Glasgow last year to try and address climate, actually in the final agreement, what was agreed was actually to phase down coal. So given the nature of the problem that we've got with the climate warming, even in a big political meeting and the current crisis that we're in, we couldn't even globally and politically agree to phase coal out. It was still phasing it down. So it was still thinking about solutions within the current business as usual and the current way of thinking. And that's also illustrated when we think about some of the other solutions. And carbon offsetting is another one of those. It's a solution that's put forward in terms of helping the market work better. But really, it's for many people have called it a scam. That all corporations are able to portray themselves as approaching net zero by carbon offsetting, still emitting carbon, but planting trees or offsetting that. But many studies have shown that simply isn't working. It works on paper, but it's not working in reality. And that's because that solution is from within the current business as usual. It's not thinking, how do we move beyond these totally unsustainable ways of thinking? And burning fossil fuel is unsustainable. Solutions need to move beyond that. So part of that, when we look at progress over the last 20, 30 years, despite all of that political activity since Rio, emissions have continued to go up. That's part of the problem is reaching agreement and being able to act collectively, and also being constrained by this hypernormalised thinking. But also it's because there's a huge power and vested interest resisting any change and exerting a very powerful influence. And it's a very powerful network that is acting to resist changes to the fundamental ways that the economy works. Growth, consumption, burning fossil fuels actually still central to the way many economies work. And this is reinforced by a number of very powerful networks of quite a narrow group of people who is made controlling wealth, controlling who owns wealth, and controlling the decision-making processes. Very influential groups and networks which are still promoting this story that we can make the world a better place simply by more growth, more consumption, and by continuing to grow fossil fuels. And these are well-known institutions: Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, American Entrepreneur Institute. Those three are in the US. Institute of Economic Ideas in America, in the UK. So those are three institutions in the UK and the US that are actively promoting scepticism about climate change in many ways. But these are very powerfully funded, very well connected in politics, and very influential in terms of legislation. So I think if we're realistic about making it happen, we need to be realistic about the powerful forces that we're up against. And we need to have an equally well-funded network, equally well-organised network to promote the story of sustainability and how we need to move forward. And they are so powerful, these big corporations. I've just put this, I'll put a link to this on our blog as well. But this is a podcast that told the story initially about how the tobacco industry really prevented action being taken to limit the sale of tobacco. And it was called the Tobacco Playbook. And essentially it just cast doubt on the scientific evidence. It said, well, the jury's still out, we don't know whether tobacco is dangerous or not. And that worked for a number of years to prevent action being taken. And the fossil fuel and oil industry have done exactly the same thing. They took the same tobacco playbook and just cast doubt on the science. Not necessarily completely open scepticism, that would have been too obvious, but actually just undermined to say, well, the scientific proof isn't there yet, despite really overwhelming proof for that. The reason they were able to do that, because there were these powerful networks, well-funded networks, and influential inside and outside government. So that's why, despite lots of political activity and lots of work, the politics is difficult, but our actions to deal with it at a local, organisational, national, global level need to have a response that deals with this, if you like, forces that are trying to maintain the status quo. So we need to be political in dealing with that. Our collective action needs to deal with that. Also, to add to the problems is our contemporary politics, especially since the financial crash in 2018, has moved much more to a populist turn, it's been called, but a more populist form of politics. In some ways, that was a reaction to people's dissatisfaction with globalization and the recent era of neoliberalism, where we've had more and more markets, privatization, globalization, but many people have missed out because of that. That's caused dissatisfaction, but the reaction to that has been a move to the right in politics and a populist politics. And the problem is with the populist form of politics, whether it's the leaders that have come in like Bolsonaro, Trump, Orban in Hungary, whether it's the move towards Brexit in the UK, it's about less cooperation, where we need more cooperation. It's about self-interest, and it's actually about a more of a sceptical and anti-science view, all of which are acting against where we need to be to deal with the problems. So this is the reality of our contemporary politics. So our making it happen and bringing about a change needs to have a powerful narrative, and we need to tell an equally powerful story than the right-wing populist politicians who, this is only from yesterday, have actually made massive progress in Sweden. So the story's just not being told powerfully enough to create a story for sustainability. And if we're going to make change, we need to do that. And we need to have a powerful narrative that the only way to solve these global problems is to make a transition. And that language is out there, quite boldly out there. And the EU, some of the language they use is that we need to have this sustainability transition across all sectors and all aspects of our economy and society. And it's far-reaching societal change. So this is from a very conventional political institution that is saying we need to have radical, sustainable transitions. So this isn't some niche idea. The difference is we haven't got powerful networks and a whole powerful body of supporting organisations to make this happen. That's where the gap is. That's where this collective organising that Matthijs spoke about needs to come in. We need to do that on the sustainability side. And really the EU is very clear in here, and other bodies are saying this as well. It's not about whether we need to make this transition. It's about we have to do it, and we have to find ways to make it happen. So we'll be forced to make it happen eventually anyway. Why not do it now when we've got time? And that means organisations and individuals, industrial sectors, making the decision to become sustainable, to make this sustainable transition, to sustainabilise, and genuinely start on that journey, and to look right inside their own organisations. This is only one set of these. What is it that's currently unsustainable about what we do? How is our current business model unsustainable? And we need to make a transition and a journey away from that. What is our plan? What is our policy? What is our strategy? To move to the position where our business model is sustainable. That might be quite a long-term transition, but we need to start that now. And we need to start that at an industrial sector level as well. And clearly, when we look at the major problems in terms of climate and the issues that we're having, most of it goes back to energy. And this clear definition, we've got the solution in some ways. The solution is to move to zero carbon, not net zero, real zero, where we're not burning fossil fuels anymore. And we need to make that journey now. But that also looks at the other aspects of our industries that are causing pollution, that are causing biodiversity loss and all of those things as well. We need to make the transition to change the look of these diagrams. Finally, the other thing we need to do as well is something about making transitions, but we also need to do that in a just way. And one of the global injustices is that although we've had these huge impacts of climate change, primarily the impacts and the drivers for that have been from the global north. the global south that has relatively little per person carbon emissions is the most affected by climate change. So there's a huge injustice there. So however we make the transition, we need to make that in a just way so that the world becomes a fairer and more equal place, that we don't just further embed this injustice. And also we need to do that when we think of really changing economic sectors. We need to think about how do we make that transition in a fair and just way. Over the past 50 years, the economy in Britain has changed, where we've really dismantled our coal industry, which has a huge positive benefit for the environment, but we could have managed that in a much more just way, to think in a way that treated communities fairly, so they could make a transition to other forms of economy. So this transition is not just a technical thing, it's about an ethical thing as well. How do we do that in a just, a meaningful and fair way? So those are three ideas, picking up the idea of politics, the current politics, and what do we need to do? We need to really make a step on this transition. It's making a political and a policy and a strategy decision, personally, organisationally and institutionally. How do we move forward to make a genuine transition to sustainability? We've got a longer version of, or a written version of our webinars. We've published some blogs, so if you're keen to read a bit more, do pick up on those blogs. And we've also done some work in terms of our teaching. We've developed a new programme which builds on a number of the ideas that we've spoken about across the 3 webinars and we've written about in the blog. So really we've tried to reinvent the MBA, the traditional MBA, but actually build it from the bottom up as a sustainable MBA. And really we're picking up all the main themes that we've been picking up in this last week. And really the whole programme is shaped around really the ideas we've chatted about and developed in our 3 webinars and blogs. Really about thinking about what are the problems we face, how can we really get a real grasp and understanding of the problems, how can we then imagine a different future, but how do we make that happen, how do we transform society? So we've shaped the whole programme around that shape. And if you go to our university website, you'll find some more details. But we think that's clearly something that's a benefit to individuals who personally want to make a contribution to sustainability, but for organisations who also want to embark on that journey. Thank you for listening to us there, and hopefully we'll pick up and have a discussion for any questions or points that you want us to amplify. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. So for anybody watching online now, please put your comments or questions in the chat. We will be able to see them and take them into the discussion. And while we're waiting for comments and questions, let me open the discussion then, Andy. Thank you for your part of the presentation. Of course, this raises a lot of other questions, and perhaps first the notion of I want to come back to this EU report about the sustainable transition, right? Which is of course very interesting and also relevant in the sense that they more or less the EU is promoting the very same thing that we are also promoting. So we are fully aligned with the EU, but then I do have much less confidence in the EU than in us ourselves. But no, but isn't it such that we are also observing here a process of hypernormalization of climate action? So that is also, of course, why we opened this webinar with the discussion of hypernormalization itself, because the tendency to hypernormalize the status quo, so basically to hypernormalize in action while at the same time proclaiming a genuine commitment to the sustainable transition risks, of course, that our language is also becoming less and less meaningful when the EU is also promoting sustainable transition, but we are not really seeing it yet.
No. I think there's a couple of things. I think we might have more confidence in ourselves, but the EU's got more money than we have. So it's got more potential to do things. But I think there is something about how, it may be a human response to bad news and problematic and crises, but in effect, we have normalised even the idea of the climate crisis has been normalised, and we get, I think there was a report out, even another scientific report out today, that it's getting, we're getting to the last moment before we can change things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure that won't be top of the news in the UK. Mm-hmm. It appears probably on page 6 of a newspaper. So I think we've almost absorbed, and the language has lost its power. I think that was published in 2019. I'd never seen that before, and I wasn't aware that the EU was using that sort of language about sustainable transition. So it isn't a language or a story that's gaining a lot of traction at the moment, even though we might agree with it.
Yeah.
But I think the other bit is part of the story talking about earlier, that the EU really still sees the world through the business as usual lens. Its solutions, like the Sustainable Development Goals, are still locked within the current paradigm. Yeah. It's still not really the Sustainable Development Goals still talk about growth and all of that. So I think definitely it's been, we've hyper-normalised the background economy as if it's the natural thing, and we've got to build the solutions from there. So excellent.
Yeah.
I've seen a question come through from Lady Deed, a good friend of mine, David, so thanks for the question, David. Fantastic presentation, thank you, says David. Given the powerful vested interests you describe, is the required level of change realistically achievable, and if so, how? Yeah. It's a brilliant question. I think that's a great one for Matthijs.
Well, this I think is this question is very much about our response as individuals, as business schools, as universities, but also as society, as collective society, to the very issues that we are confronted with. So, returning to the question, what is to be done? And then on the one hand, and I think we also can witness this increasingly, I guess, in society, is a degree of hopelessness. And people have lost their hope and are either in denial, so we see active climate deniers, people who cannot yet cope with the realities of climate change, resort into denial and try to live their lives day by day or as meaningful as possible. And of course, for many people, the reality is that they have to survive from day to day. For instance, when we are faced with the rising energy bills and then the need to survive economically. But the question then is there actually something that we can do? And so I've been inspired by the ideas around finding courage in hopelessness. So in that sense, perhaps your friend David is right. We do live in hopeless times, but then the question is for us, okay, are we then retreating into inertia, into hopelessness, or are we thinking about what we also could do? So very practically, for instance, for us as academics in a university, we can ask ourselves the question, okay, we can, on the one hand, we can just continue our lives, our work, we can just teach our students the way we've always done. It's the easiest way, we can do the things. But on the other hand, we can also ask ourselves the question, but then what can we actually do? And so I think that we, as individuals and collectives, should always keep on asking ourselves this question and it's a question about individual and collective agency. And I think those questions we need to discuss also in collectively with each other in groups. And then we can hopefully also find ways to actually contribute to this sustainable transition in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and I think although it's a situation that can cause us to feel powerless and hopeless, I think the other part is this actually taking a historical perspective and a materialist perspective to say this isn't about this abstract thing called capitalism or neoliberalism. They are actual institutions, actual practices, actual organisations, and historically things do change. People were able to lobby over a long period to bring about an end to slavery, to bring about the votes for women in the UK. Those were societal transformations which were against huge vested interests, but the end result was a political strategy about winning hearts and minds, but actually changing laws as well. So I think part of this transformation and how we do it has to be a strategy that encompasses a real political strategy. How can we achieve this in real material ways? What sort of laws do we need to be able to change this? How can we change the way we invest? How do we change the way we provide pensions? Because much of that is generated through investment in fossil fuels. So all these locked-in interests, how can we materially move to a sustainable pension system, for instance? So I think it's about tackling material things rather than purely thinking, well, this is abstract and the natural state. We can't do anything about it.
And your pension will get more and more concrete with the years. Is there other questions? Or,
just had another one through.
Okay, let's do that, because otherwise,
I think it says Kappa on there. Kappa Lesniak. Thank you. I'm due to be studying a Masters in Marketing and be interested to make a deeper link between marketing and sustainability and ethics. Definitely given me something to think about. That's excellent, Casper.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. We haven't talked about sustainable marketing in much depth so far in the many projects that we have done so far. So I'm very happy to hear this comment as well, because it's also another reminder for us to dive into this. I hope Casper is going to do the master here in Lincoln. So, but I think marketing, of course, is crucial because it's crucial because it's the way organizations communicate with customers, with consumers, with society. And so there's an essential role, of course, for marketing to play in terms of also of moving beyond and away from the idea of greenwashing and contributing to hypernormalizing climate action by companies, which does not have any relationship with actual practices. And it requires a rethinking, I think, among marketing professionals and marketing studies and discipline of how can we create and how can we do our bit in this whole debate, and how can we contribute to a much more, in that sense, genuine or truthful way of mediating, so to say, between organizations and consumers and society.
I think this transition at sector levels and organisational level, that professional or professions level, is one of the key areas, because although we might make a change within an organisation, the institution of marketing as a profession cuts across all organisations. So a real genuine transition to a sustainable marketing profession that doesn't cause all this damage actually will be very powerful. We've just done some work recently, there's a link on the blog to some work we've been doing about thinking about sustainable HRM profession. How could that profession, so we could do the same for accounting, we could do the same for academic. What does it mean to be a sustainable academic in a business school? So we can make these individual transitions which can influence much more broadly our sectors and professions. But the other thing your question raises to me is there's something about marketing in a responsible way that doesn't just promote more and more consumption, pollution, damaging of resources, but actually if you like, the forces that are trying to maintain the status quo have very effectively marketed their ideas that those unsustainable practices are going to solve our problems. So this transition to sustainability needs to actually be much more smarter about its marketing. The EU's message was very good about sustainable transition, but it's not out there, it's not marketed very powerfully. It doesn't seem to have powerfully influenced any manifestos of political parties, whereas the countervailing force is very good at that. It appears in political manifestos, other broader strategies. So certainly the skills of marketing could really benefit the broadening of this idea as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think there's other questions coming in, otherwise.
Yeah, we've got another question here from Dom. At a Lincolnshire level, we have the leisure sector showing interest in making actual changes to support more sustainable businesses. Any thoughts on where to start to help support them? Thinking about the leisure sector.
You are based in more based in Lincolnshire, but generally I would say such questions are precisely the questions that we need to be asking. Yeah. So where to start? We want to make this transformation towards a more sustainable profession, sustainable business model for the leisure sector here in Lincolnshire. I think again what we need to do is first come together, and I don't think that businesses should do this on their own, but it should be a collective effort. And I hope at least that the university can also play a role there, or the council, or other parties that we have reach beyond the individual organizations, but can bring the organizations together. And let's just sit together and talk about this. Take time and see how we can also help and support each other. That's also an important aspect. So that organizations should not also compete with each other for how they do it, but in this sense we should really collaborate with each other.
And that's part of the feature of that sort of the other work we're doing around that programme I mentioned earlier on, is about we're trying to think of a new way to do knowledge production, a new way to do higher education. That if we're going to develop a sustainable leisure sector, the answer and the solutions really don't exist at the moment to that. We need to have a process where we can create that knowledge in a collaborative way to create those solutions. And really we're talking about this process of engaging, imagining what that might look like, imagining the extent to which it's unsustainable now. I think we're arguing really we should actually start with current unsustainability and solve today's problems, which will help us move towards sustainability. So there's something about working from current material unsustainability. How can we design solutions that will lead us to a transition to sustainability that can still provide employment, well-being, healthy economies, etc., but in a way that doesn't damage the environment? That's a really great question, that.
Yeah. Okay, I will. Can I ask then another question which I have here, because Andy, you also spoke about, of course, the notion that we should stop with business as usual, but at the same time, politically, we see that the failure of neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism is feeding a populist, not so much turn, but a populist rise. And what we see there actually is that people are just very dissatisfied and frustrated about the failings of 50 years of neoliberal society, which is one major explanation given in the literature, given by political thinkers, why populist parties are currently benefiting in the elections. And so, okay, it is clear that we have to learn also from them in the sense of how to mobilize the popular vote, so to say. And then later on, of course, you talked about the need for a powerful narrative, and a powerful narrative for sustainability or the sustainable transition. So, in what way do you have ideas? How that narrative could look like or sound like? For instance, to reach out to the people, the many victims in society of 50 years of neoliberal capitalism.
Yeah, I think whenever there's a crisis or a threat and rapid change, people are fearful of that change, and they are materially missing out or are less well off than they were before. Maybe their jobs have been outsourced to another country. So people they are genuine feelings and genuine fears. I don't think we should overlook that. Those people have got genuine concerns. A populist politics offers solutions to that, but they're very simplistic solutions, and are solutions that might sort of present allay people's immediate fears, but aren't solutions that will solve these global problems. And in some ways, we have to have a narrative that isn't just from a rational point of view, so presenting a rational solution. We have to recognise that the genuine emotive and fear and emotions that people feel, the threats they feel about these crises, we need to meet that as well. This is about emotions as well as being totally rational. So I think we need to tell a compelling story that gives at least some, although we know the problems are complex and the solutions are complex, we need to offer a story that gives enough certainty, perhaps even around the process, that process is going to be a just process. It will solve these problems, but it's going to be in a just way that genuinely makes the world a better place. I think that is partly about the broader story, but partly about starting to have more examples where it's working. Mm-hmm. Populism is on the surface happening and people can see it. We need to have more evidence of sustainability and the transition to sustainability working. And there are examples out there of that, but they're just, at the moment, they're not a sufficient scale, or they're not marketed with a sufficient compelling narrative. So I think we need to move away from focusing on rationality in total to recognise this is about people's real fears and emotions as well, that our narrative needs to satisfy.
Yes, that's a very good point indeed. Is there another question on the chat or not?
Just the only thing I wanted to pick up just on your part, Matthijs, when you were talking about what that might mean in organisations. How do you think organisations can make a step towards that more greater sort of democracy, if you like, in organisations? Many of us work in very hierarchical organisations where we may be given a fair amount of freedom and scope, but in an organisational setting, we're still actually waiting for decisions up the hierarchical tree. How can organisations start to address that?
I've ever since I became aware of the dominant organizational structure that we have designed basically globally, which is more or less the top-down structure, the hierarchical way of thinking about organizations and how organizations can perform best and so on. It always surprised me so much that it's exactly counter our idea of political democracy, and because in the West especially, we still tend to believe that democracy is the best way, or what's the famous saying, the least worst option to run our society. And when we enter our work and when we enter a job, then we automatically adhere to the hierarchical structure of organizational life. And there is, of course, I've come to understand this, and that on the one hand there is, of course, an appealing part to it, because you can just enter an organization and you are told what to do. It gives kind of the security. Okay, if I just do what I'm being told, and I get my salary for that, and I get a little bit of development and social connections, I can have a pretty good life in my organization. But as we have also seen now over the last, I don't know how many decades, is that this kind of idea of the top-down organization, the hierarchical organization, it is utterly unable to deal with the issues that we have been discussing today and in the previous webinars as well. So generally, organizational leaders, they and this is of course well known, they function on the basis of shareholder value and self-interest and so on and so on. So there's hardly any reason for organizational leaders beyond PR or brand management or so on to genuinely transform organizations into sustainable organizations. And this remains the main problem. So then the question is, okay, what can we do? Ultimately, of course, we have to think about governmental regulation. So we should vote for the right parties who demand, so that we can form governments that can implement proper tax laws, for instance, that organizations are cannot offshore their taxes to their profits to tax havens and so on. So of course, we need the societal infrastructure to be able to also do that. But at the same time, when we are part of organizations, I think it changes with our first and foremost with ourselves, of course, and our ideas and our beliefs in how organizations should be functioning and should work. And that means a rethinking of our own roles in our organization. So we are not just there to do the job and get paid for it, and we should not think about the kind of all the things that the organization is doing in terms of destruction of the planet, for instance. But it is in that sense, it is our task, as you could almost say our duty as employees, also to first and foremost think about our own role. What is our own role as individuals? Now, then we are immediately stumbling upon the difficulty that it's very hard to make a difference individually. So hence, we should talk to this with our colleagues. We should have. In most organizations, there's a frequency of department meetings, or where we talk about the daily affairs and what are we doing and so on. So especially in such meetings, there should be just every time there is such a meeting, there should be a discussion. Okay, how we are doing with in terms of sustainability. Or I've also worked, as you know, on dignity, workplace dignity. So we could also, in every meeting, we could raise the sustainability and the dignity question. So how are we doing as a team in terms of sustainability of our practices, of what we're doing, the dignity of people and others in and outside the organization. And so this might be a starting point for individuals and for teams and so on to start this bottom-up process of the sustainability transition. And then, of course, as I also mentioned, perhaps we should also extend this towards trade unions for sustainability and other forms of collective organizing in and beyond organizations. And then, of course, we should also acknowledge that there are many business leaders, especially smaller businesses and so on, who are very much genuinely motivated to become sustainable, but who do not have yet the capacity or the ideas, and that is again a question of collaboration.
No, I think that's some great questions today, and I think it's a nice place to finish. That if we're thinking about how do we make things happen, it starts with us as individuals making it happen. So in some ways we're making a small journey ourselves on this transition to sustainable university, sustainable academics in a university. What does it mean to make a transition ourselves? And it's just a matter of making a step on that journey. But finishing on that point, I think is a very powerful finish there. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Matthijs, and thank you for Chris for doing the work, helping us put this together today. Thank you for joining us. The blogs and the recordings of the webinars are available on YouTube. Have a look at our website. We're very happy to chat further to people, so you can find our emails on the university website as well in the directory. So very happy to chat to individuals or come and talk to organisations as well. So thank you again, and hopefully chat with you again in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.